Hey, now, if you thought the stories of Scotch and Irish whiskey were great, we have an even better story for you now. And that's the story of bourbon and Tennessee whiskey and rye whiskey. We're talking about American whiskeys. In fact, in 1964, Congress passed a resolution saying that bourbon is our native spirit. We're mostly going to be focusing on corn for America's whiskeys. The reason for that is really the following. When we started out as a group of 13 colonies, all the 13 colonies bunched up on the eastern seaboard, the only grain that really grew well along that eastern seaboard, mostly because it was cold and windy and the soil was rather thin, was rye. So the first great whiskey, the first whiskey that really was popular in colonial America, was rye whiskey. Corn at this point, prior to the Revolutionary War, really wasn't even a factor. Then we had the Revolutionary War. Of course, the country went deeply into debt. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton are looking at a $51 million war debt. Let's tax all the distillers and the people who enjoy distilled spirits. Alexander Hamilton goes to Washington and says, you know, man, we are really deep here in debt. France and Spain are breathing down our necks. They want their money back because they both helped us defeat the British. And the coffers are empty. So Hamilton suggests to Washington that they tax distillation. Now, in the meantime, right after the Revolutionary War, there was a great migration, particularly of German, Dutch, Scots-Irish into western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, and they were continuing that tradition of making rye whiskey. Now, the thing is, they were making really nice rye whiskey, particularly in western Pennsylvania. But then Hamilton and Washington start taxing and taxing. Right after the Revolutionary War, ended in 1789, and so in 1790, 1791, these tax enactments work their way through Congress, and all hell is breaking loose on the front, on the western front, with people in western Pennsylvania saying, wait a minute, just like the Scots were saying, we have an inalienable right to be using something, a commodity that we grow, that we're barely making any money out of anyway. There's virtual subsistence existences. So why are we getting so heavily taxed? So they stage a revolt in and around what is now Pittsburgh. Washington and Hamilton say, hey, you know, we can't have this. We can't have it basically an insurrection. We can't have a secession of western Pennsylvania from all the other states. We're just trying to pull our act together as a country as it is, because there's a new country. They send 13,000 troops to quell the revolt. They quelled the revolution, but in the meantime, the people in western Pennsylvania were saying, you know, who needs this? So then, in the early 1790s, after this little dust-up, a lot of people from western Pennsylvania, who were all whiskey makers at that point, beer makers, moved down the Ohio River to northern central Kentucky. Well, this is good. The land, we've got fantastic water, because there was a limestone shelf that came down and hits all the way through. The limestone shelf goes from Ontario, Canada, all the way down into central Kentucky. And the limestone, all their spring water, gets filtered through these layers and layers of limestone. And that's why the water is so incredibly pure in Kentucky. Water is a key element for distillation, as we were talking about on Monday. Distilleries need lots of water. So they had plentiful water. Then, from the Indians, they learned how to grow something that changed the course of American distilling forever. Corn. Rye didn't grow as well in north central Kentucky as corn did. Why? Because it's so much more humid. Rye likes a drier, cooler climate. And corn just goes wild in that kind of climate, in that kind of terrain. So they had everything. They had location, they had an open land. They weren't really fighting Native Americans. They had a crop of corn, of grain, that just took off like crazy. By 1790, there were 25 people in north central Kentucky with about 10 or so stills. By 1810, 20 years later, there were 20,000 people in north central Kentucky, and there were 2,000 stills working.
And at some point, we uniquely in America moved to charred oak barrels, and there's been a lot of speculation that we had old herring barrels, but the continuous distillation isn't up to like vodka proofs. It's down to a pretty low proof. They still want some of those flavor compounds. They just want to do it very efficiently. So there's always this balance between flavor and efficiency. And things are looking up, and then what happens? Prohibition.
After Prohibition, very, very few distilleries reopened because Prohibition was 14 years. But then it took a while because by law, and we should probably get into this now, by law, you have to age your bourbon for 2 years, minimum of 2 years in new charred oak barrels. No sooner do they get rolling and World War II breaks out, just a few years later. And the government again says, look, we need alcohol for the war effort. So you have to switch over from making distillate for whiskey to distillate to support munitions and for the Red Cross. Single malt Scotch took off in the early 90s. And the Kentucky distillers said, wait a minute, we
got whiskey too.
We have whiskeys that are absolutely every bit as good as what the Scots are bringing out now with their single malts. And that was really the dawn of the small batch and the single barrel revolution. And that, I think, has been as much a part of the Renaissance with bourbon as anything else. In 1964, something really positive happened for the bourbon industry. And that was Congress passed a resolution naming bourbon as America's native spirit. And I think as much as anything, that really gave some sort of substance, that really gave some sort of calling card that the distillers in America could take around the world saying, yeah, you know, Congress is saying, we're the native spirit of America. Bourbon must be made from at least 51% corn. And as David said earlier, the mash bill is always a combination of usually 3 different grain types, but at least 51% corn must be in there. The spirit must be aged in new charred oak barrels for at least 2 years. Bourbon cannot be distilled at higher than 80% alcohol. And the reality is, and David and Steve, and we all know this, most of the bourbons that are made, certainly the better ones, the creme de la creme, are usually distilled out at like 68, maybe 72.
Some even lower than that.
Lower than that, but
Wild Turkey is very low.
Much, much lower than 80%. That's just the ceiling. They can't distill at higher than 80% alcohol, but virtually all of them are much lower. And the reason for that is the lower the end game alcohol level, the more character is left in the distillate. Also, so we've got can't be distilled higher than 160 proof or 80% alcohol, and only can be reduced with distilled water.
Rye whiskey, it's the mirror image of bourbon, 51% rye, minimum of 51% rye. Corn whiskey, plain, if you call it corn whiskey, it has to be at least 80% corn, and it cannot be aged in new charred barrels. Cannot be.
Cannot be.
You can use old charred barrels, reused ones. You can use other things. If bourbon is aged in a reused barrel, not a new charred barrel, you can't call it bourbon. You can call it American whiskey.
99.9% of the barrels used for whiskey aging in America is oak, particularly white oak from Indiana and Missouri. But in the case of bourbon, there are 4 levels of char on the inside. And the reason that they char them, as David said, is to get out impurities, get out pests. But it also helps it helps the coopers to shape the barrel. Because as you heat the oak staves, they become a little bit more pliant so that they're able to shape them into the shape of a barrel. But they have 4 stages of char. Here's this, I'll pass these around, but this smaller, I made these in different sizes just so we could point them out. This is a level 1 char, and you'll see that it's hardly coming in, and this is only about 20 to 25 seconds over this incredibly hot flame that's coming up. They have the barrels that are open on both sides. They just have 2 hoops around them so that the barrel is basically in its shape, but it's open on both ends. Put it over a very, very hot flame, and when it's 20 or 25 seconds, it's level 1, which is barely getting into the wood surface. This larger, look at the side on this where you could see it's in about a 1/16 of an inch. This is a level 2, and it goes all the way up to level 4. And level 4 will usually go into almost 1/8 of an inch. And so let's pass these around. Now the key here is that when you get to level 3 and level 4, you're actually beginning, it's become so hot that you actually, the natural sugars in the oak become caramelized. So keep that in mind, because most of the distillers today, certainly the big 8 and the other 2 that are kind of part-time, always, just about today, always prefer level 4 or even level 3 char. Bourbons, Tennessee whiskeys, ryes, they're jumping off the charts. You can't get them. In fact, rye is so popular, and now you can barely find it anyplace. So this is what you need to know, because bourbon, Tennessee, rye, these are important ingredients to cocktails. So don't forget, these are our whiskeys. Our stamp of approval as Americans are on these whiskeys. Use them, enjoy them, serve them.